Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I'm back with another full step-by-step PC build guide for you, and I'm going to be putting all the parts you can see in front of me together and coming up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. So if you've never built a PC before, you've come to the right place. Okay, so let's have a look at the parts I've chosen for today's build. So starting off with the case, this is a mini-itx case. It's the Cooler Master NR200P. And although it's a small case, it offers an awful lot of options when it comes to building a PC, and you can build a number of completely different looking PCs in the same case. The first thing to mention is the front panel is interchangeable, and the case comes with a tempered glass panel in the box, so we can swap out this front panel for a tempered glass panel if we wanted to. The other thing to mention is the case has a vertical GPU mount and riser card included with it. So again, if we wanted to, we can actually go ahead and install our graphics card in a vertical orientation in this case without having to purchase any extra equipment. So although this is a small case, you can actually fit an awful lot of cooling in it. So you can fit a 240mm radiator down at the bottom or on the side, and as well at the side you can actually go as large as a 280mm radiator. So I've actually chosen a 240mm AIO, and in this build today I'm going to be installing it on the side, and in a further build I'm going to go ahead and install it down the bottom. The reason I picked the 240 is I can compare the results with both thermally and with noise levels with the radiator in each of the different locations, and I'm going to release that in a future video looking at the thermal testing. I'm also going to compare that to the previous air-cooled build that I have done. So when you look at that video, you're going to be able to decide which of the three builds that I've done in this case that you want to follow. The AIO that I've chosen for today's build is the Cooler Master Liquid ML240 mirror. And this is a relatively new AIO from Cooler Master, and the reason that I've chosen it is that the fans that come on the radiator are the same fans that come with our case. So we're going to have 4 fans the same, and it's definitely going to help with the aesthetic of today's build. So our 240mm AIO should do a great job of cooling our CPU, and the CPU I've chosen for today's build is the Ryzen 7 3700X. This is an 8-core CPU which should perform great in gaming, but also equally well in content creation. For the motherboard, I've gone with MSI's B550i Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. This motherboard has 2 M.2 SSD slots, and like most B550 motherboards, only one of them is Gen 4, while the other one will support Gen 3 speeds. With that in mind, I've picked up 2 M.2 SSDs, both in 1TB in size. I've picked up one Gen 4 drive, the 980 Pro from Samsung, and another one from Samsung in Gen 3 speeds, the 970 Evo. I've also picked up a 500GB SATA SSD. It's from Kingston, the KC600. I think I've probably got enough storage with the 2TB on the M.2 SSDs, but I want to show you how to install a SATA drive in this case as well. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Trident Z Neo at 3600MHz speed. Powering the whole build, I've got a 750W SFX power supply from Corsair. It's the SF750. For the graphics card, I've gone with the RTX 2070 Super. For cooling, the case comes with 2 120mm fans included, and they're designed to be used at the top of the case. But we can actually fit up to 7 case fans in this case. So that's the 2 120mm fans which come with the case at the top. We can fit an additional 2 120 or 140mm fans on the side, and down the bottom we can fit an additional 2 120mm fans. On the rear of the case there's space for a 92mm fan. So as I've already mentioned, our AIO comes with 2 fans included, and the case comes with 2 fans as well. So that's going to leave us 3 potential fan slots left. So I have picked up an additional 2 Noctua fans to use down the bottom of the case, and importantly these are the low profile fans at only 15mm in depth. And I'm giving a little bit of a spoiler away from my thermal testing, which I've already done with the air-cooled build. And definitely down the bottom below the GPU you want to use low profile fans rather than standard thickness fans, because your temperatures are going to be much better with this. So make sure you check out that thermal testing video where I'm going to share many other pearls to building in this case. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. The first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters, anything that's going to get in our way during the build. To remove the side panel, all we need to do is pull it out from the back, and then it should simply lift up and out. The other side panel is exactly the same. Again, just pull it out from the back and lift it up and out. To remove the front panel, all we need to do is pull it away, and it should clip out. To remove the top panel, all we need to do is lift up at the front of the case, and it should simply pop off. There's a removable fan and radiator bracket on the side, held on with 2 screws here. Once the screws are removed, it can simply be lifted off. Down at the bottom of the case, we've got an accessory box. We'll have a look at what it contains later in this section. This bracket is our power supply holder. It's held on with 2 screws at the back of the case. Before we can remove the bracket from the case, we just need to free up the case cables and the Velcro straps. We should now simply be able just to lift it off. This front section of the case is held on with 4 screws here, here, here and here. And then we should simply be able to lift it off. To remove the bottom of the case, we just need to loosen this screw. And then we should simply be able just to lift the case away from the bottom. Looking at the bottom of the case, if we turn it upside down, you'll notice at the bottom there's a dust filter which can be simply pulled away, held on by magnets. Likewise, in each of the side panels, we've also got dust filters, again held on by magnets, which can simply be removed. So that's the case prepared. We've got all the panels off. Obviously you don't need to remove as many panels as I have, but if you do, it's going to make building in the case so much easier. The problem with any small form factor case is building it is so much more tricky than in a bigger case. We've made just much more room for us to get in from the top and at the front. So hopefully the build process is going to be a little bit easier because of it. And any time that we've spent taking the panels off and on will hopefully save us time later in the build. Next thing I want to do is have a look at what comes with the accessories. This case comes with 2 accessory boxes. In the first one, we've got our tempered glass panel. So we can replace the front side panel with this. This is the second accessory box, so we'll open it up and see what's in it. So this is what's contained in that accessory box. So we've got 2 120mm fans together with the mounting solution to attach the fans to the top of the case. So these are brackets which simply pull out, and then we're going to be able to push them through and secure to the top of the case, and they are compatible with other 120mm fans. Looking at the fans, they've got 4-pin connections on them. We've also got a PWM splitter cable, so it's a 1 connection to 3 connection, which is very useful for building in an ITX case because generally the motherboards have very limited fan headers. We've got a riser cable for our graphics card, which we're going to need to use the vertical slots. And then what I'll do is I'll open this bag up separately and talk you through each of the screws. This is what's contained in the screw section of the accessory box. So part A is a little adapter which helps you loosen and tighten up the standoffs at the back of the case where the motherboard will be screwed into. So this simply fits over the standoffs, and you can then use a normal screwdriver to loosen them and tighten them up again. Part B is some cable ties to help with cable management in the case. We've got 12 screws C, and you can tell screws C apart from screws J. They look very similar to each other. Screw J has a more rounded head and there's only 4 of them. Screw C is designed to secure the motherboard to the case and also to secure the power supply to the bracket. And like I said, we've got 12 of these. Parts D and E look fairly similar. If we have a look at part D, there's only 4 of them, and it has a little cross at the top of the thread. Part E, there's much more of them, there's 12 of them, and it has a straight thread at the top of it. So part D, you're going to screw into the back of a 3.5-inch drive, and this lets you mount one 3.5-inch drive in the case. Part E will screw into a 2.5-inch hard drive or SSD, and as we've got 12, each drive is going to take 4. It's going to let you mount 3 drives in the case. Part F is where you're actually going to mount the drives to. So these are going to slip into little sections in the case, and then what you can do is after you've screwed this into the drive is simply going to push into here, and it's going to hold the drive in place. So we've got 12 of these, again letting you mount 3 drives in the case. And the final set of screws J, you're going to use these to help secure the top of the case to the rest of the case. And again, this is an option if you want to do this. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can on the table before we install it into the case. So we're going to go ahead and put our CPU into the socket in the middle of the motherboard. We're going to install our M.2 SSDs, one here on the front and a further drive on the back of the motherboard. And we're also going to insert our RAM into here before putting the motherboard into the case. So the first step is to prepare the socket to receive the CPU. To do this, all we need to do is lift this little clip here all the way over to the right hand side. Okay, so this is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding the CPU by the sides, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the bottom of it. If I do that, I can make the CPU absolutely useless. The other thing I want to point out about the CPU, if you notice that the corner at the top of the screen has a little gold triangle on it, and none of the other corners on the CPU have that triangle. If I turn the CPU over, you'll notice the same corner that had the gold triangle, which is now the one down the bottom left hand side, also has a little gold mark on this side, and that is to line the CPU up with the socket in the right orientation. So we take a closer look at our socket. What you'll notice, this corner over the top left hand side has a little white mark on it, and this is the corner that we need to line up with the gold triangle on the CPU. So to install our CPU, all we need to do is hover it over the socket, and we're going to let it fall into the socket. So I'm just going to move it about a little bit till it falls in. And you hear there, the CPU has just fallen into the socket. It's really important I don't go pressing down where I can damage the pins. All I need to do to finish installing the CPU is to close this little clip. And we've now installed our CPU. Next thing to do is install the front M.2 SSD. To do that, we just need to remove 2 screws from the heatsink over the top of the socket. So we now can move the heatsink to expose the M.2 SSD socket. We need to be careful because the heatsink is still held on with a wire, so all we're going to do is move it over to the side and out of the way of the socket. This is our M.2 SSD. What you'll notice over the right hand side, there's gold connectors where it's going to plug into the motherboard. There's a further little gold connector over the left hand side, and that is where we're going to secure it in place using a screw that we're going to get in our motherboard box. As we've mentioned, this motherboard has 2 M.2 SSD sockets. We've got one on the front and one on the back. It's important to check the specifications of each of the socket on your motherboard because in general they're not created equally. If we look at our socket on the front, we'll notice that there's a heatsink over it with a fan, which is going to help keep our drive cool under load. I'll show you the one on the back in a minute, but there's no heatsink on the one on the back. So already the one on the front seems to be a better socket, particularly for a Gen 4 drive, which is going to get much hotter than a Gen 3 drive under load. The other thing to look and see which of the sockets supports which speed. Our motherboard manual tells us that the front socket supports Gen 4 speeds, while the back socket only supports Gen 3 speeds. So it's important we install our Gen 4 drive into the socket on the front of the motherboard and the Gen 3 drive into the one on the back of the motherboard. So all motherboards are different, so it's really important you check the specifications of your own motherboard if you're using a different one than what I'm using here. The other important thing to mention, particularly with mini-itx builds, they are much more complicated to add to at a later stage. So if you think you're going to need more storage, I would recommend you put it in at this stage in the build, because it's going to be an awful pain to take the motherboard out at a later stage to get access to that socket at the back of the motherboard. Okay, so having a look here, this is our M.2 SSD socket here, over to the right hand side, and over to the left hand side we've got 2 standoffs here, which we can secure it in place. And if we just line our M.2 SSD up, we can see it's this standoff in the furthest position that we're going to secure it into. Other motherboards will come with just one standoff, and what you can do is unscrew it and move it along to a different socket if you've got a different sized drive. To install our M.2 SSD, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Next, we need to secure it in place using the screw that comes with the motherboard. Next, we can put the heatsink back on and secure it in place. Before we put the heatsink back on, it's important to mention if you are using the motherboard for the first time, quite often on these heatsinks you will have some plastic protection which you should remove before first use. So we can simply return the heatsink to its normal location, put our screws back in, and then secure the heatsink to the motherboard again. This is our second M.2 SSD socket on the back of the motherboard. Again, you can see one standoff here and a slot for another standoff. So the standoff looks to be in the right place, so we can go ahead and install our drive into the socket, just inserting it at a slight angle, and then all we need to do is secure it in place using the screw from the motherboard box. Okay, so this is our RAM. One important thing to notice with it is the gold connectors at the bottom. You'll notice that the one over to the right hand side is slightly longer than the one on the left hand side. So it's really important when lining it up in the socket that you insert it the right way round. To prepare the motherboard to receive the RAM, all we need to do is open these two little clips on the sockets. Now it's important to note some motherboards will have clips on both sides of the socket. This motherboard just has clips on this side. The next thing to do is to line the RAM up with the socket. Once we're happy everything is lined up, all we need to do is apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and it will lock into place and this little clip will close. Just the same process with the second stick of RAM, line it up with the socket, and then we're going to just apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and then it locks and clicks into place. So as I've already done a build in this case, I've learned that plugging the additional power supply cable for the CPU, which is in the top left hand corner of the motherboard, is really difficult once the motherboard has been installed in the case. So I'm going to go ahead and install this on the table now before we put the motherboard into the case. And we're going to get this cable in our power supply and we'll deal more with the power supply later on in the build. So it just pushes and clips into place. We're now ready to put our motherboard into the case. Importantly, if you look at the back of the case, you can see the 4 standoffs where we're going to screw our motherboard into. Also, there's a cutout at the back of the case. Our motherboard has the AIO shield pre-installed, so we can go straight ahead and put our motherboard into the case. If your motherboard is a different one and it comes with a separate AIO shield, you need to clip the AIO shield into this cutout before you put your motherboard into the case. So all we need to do is lower our motherboard into the case, lining it up with the hole in the back of the case. Then we can go ahead and secure the motherboard with 4 screws from the accessory box. Okay, so you could see how plugging this cable in at the top with this extension cable for the power supply directly above it could actually be quite tricky. And you always learn things from doing builds. One of the things I've learned from doing any PC build, but in particularly in a mini-itx case, is to get your case cables plugged in as early as you can. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. So you may ask, what are the case cables? And the case cables are the cables coming from the front I/O. So here we've got a USB 3.0 cable, and that lets the 2 USB Type A ports on the top of the case work. So we have to plug this into the motherboard if those ports are going to work. We've also got a HD audio cable, and that is going to let our headphone and microphone jack in the front of the case work as well. One of the nice things that Cooler Master have done is they have combined all these tricky little cables into one single pin. With these cables, you normally get your power switch, your power LED, and your reset switch. And quite often with other cases, these come as lots of separate little cables that need to be plugged into the one header. Cooler Master have put them all together in one plug, which is great, and it's going to make this whole process so much easier. So let's go ahead and get these plugged in. So this is our USB 3.0 cable, and it's going to go into this header here on the motherboard. If we look closely at the cable, you'll notice there's a little notch on one side, and the header also has a notch on it as well, so it's important we line these up. Out of all the headers on the motherboard, this is the one where you're most likely to damage the pins on the motherboard, and I have done this in a previous motherboard and it's not very pleasant because it means your front ports don't work after this. So we need to line things up really carefully, and we're not going to apply a lot of pressure. If it's difficult to plug in, we're just going to stop and readjust things. So I've got things lined up and I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure, and there it's clipped into place. Okay, next cable to plug in is our HD audio cable. It's going to go in this header in the bottom row just over to the left hand side. If we note the pin on the top row, the second pin from the right hand side is missing. There's also a pin missing on the cable, so we'll need to line it up the right way, and that is with the HD audio text facing upwards. Okay, that's lined up, and we just go ahead and push it on. You can see the cooler is getting a little bit in the way, but it's not too bad. Okay, so the header next to that is where we need to plug in our power LED, power switch and reset switch. And as we've mentioned, it's with the text with the power switch and power LED facing upwards. So as well as plugging our case cables in at this stage, it's also a good idea to plug any additional cables into the motherboard, because as we start adding more and more into the build, it's going to get harder to access the headers on the motherboard. So I did mention we're going to install a SATA drive in this case, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the SATA data cable into the motherboard. So our motherboard has 4 SATA headers here, so all we need to do is plug our SATA data cable into any one of these headers. It is important to note that the headers on the motherboard have an L-shaped, and also at the end of the cable there's also an L shape, so we just need to line the L's up the same way round. Okay, so I'm just going to plug the cable in, lining up the L's, and it pushes and locks in place. Okay, so we're now ready to install our power supply into its bracket. So this is the bracket, this is the bottom of the bracket, this is the top. We can see at the top of the bracket there's some holes for screws. Looking at our power supply, this is where the holes are, so it's going to go this way round. Important thing to look at the power supply, we can see there's an intake fan on this side. If we install it this way round, the intake fan is going to be facing the inside of the case, so the fan is going to be getting hot air from inside the case. If we install it this way round, the fan is going to be facing out against the mesh panel at the back, and it's going to be getting cool air from outside the case. So we want to install it this way round. So all we need to do is insert the bracket over the top of the power supply, and then we can go ahead and screw in and secure it in place. And again, we're just going to use the same screws that we used to secure the motherboard from that accessory box. Next thing for us to do is to plug the cables into the power supply. So starting off with a 24-pin cable, it's made up in 2 parts at this end, and it's going to go into here and here. Our graphics card is going to require one 8-pin and one 6-pin cable, and if we look at our graphics card cable, we've got a 6-pin and a 2-pin which join together to form an 8-pin, and we've got another one here which is a 6-pin and a 2-pin. So the one cable is going to supply all the power we need for our graphics card. It mentions PCIe on one side, on the other side it says Type 4, so it's the Type 4 end that we need to plug into the power supply. So I'm going to go ahead and plug it in down to the bottom row. I'm going to leave this pin free for the CPU cable which we have already plugged into the motherboard, and I'm going to go ahead and plug in our PCIe cable here. Next cable to plug in is our SATA power cable. It has 4 different SATA power connectors on it, and each of them can power one device. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the top row just beside the 24-pin cable. Okay, so that's the power supply ready. We're going to go ahead and get it into the case. Just before we put our power supply into the case, 2 things to point out. So you can see at the back of this motherboard there actually is quite a large cutout, and you've actually got full access to this rare M.2 SSD slot. So that's great. What I said at the start, there's not the need to actually go and install this M.2 SSD at the start, because you can access it quite easily at any stage by removing the rear panel. My last mini-itx build, the TU150, I needed to do exactly that. I installed one drive and later decided I was going to have to install another. And actually this slot was blocked at the back of the case, so I had to completely disassemble everything just to install a drive. So you're going to be okay in this case. Next thing to look at is when we're inserting our power supply back in, we've got a little code here into which of these clips we should use. So we've got an SFX power supply, so we're going to install it into this clip here. If you've got an SFXL, you're going to use the SOT above. Okay, just before we go ahead and put the power supply into the case, I'm going to go ahead and plug the other end of the CPU power cable into the power supply. So there we go, that's plugged in. Now the other thing I have learned from building in this case is once the power supply is installed, plugging in the 24-pin cable is incredibly difficult because the power supply is going to be right up against here. You're going to have your RAM here and it's really difficult to plug in. And in fact, the last build I had to do, I had to remove the power supply to make sure I had plugged the cable in securely. So you learn from what you've done before. I'm going to go ahead and plug in the 24-pin cable into the motherboard before we install the power supply. So I'm just going to bring it through. Again, there's a little notch on the cable and there's a notch on the socket. So we just need to line them up and then just press, and you get a little bit of a click as it goes into place. Okay, so we now can go ahead and secure the power supply in the case. Importantly, I'm going to make sure the fan is facing the rear of the case. And we're just going to go ahead and install this into the second slot from the top. And then we can go ahead and secure the power supply with the 2 screws we removed at the rear. Okay, so we can see our power supply's intake fan is facing the outside of the case where it's going to get plenty of fresh air. Final thing with installing the power supply is to plug our power cable extension into the back of the power supply. It's also important at this stage to make sure our power supply is switched on, which ours is, because once we go ahead and put the fans at the top of the case, we're not going to have access to this power switch. Next, we can go ahead and install our SATA SSD. So we turn it over and look at the mounting holes at the back. We've got the little screws from our case accessory box. Remember, this is a 2.5-inch drive, so we're going to use the screws with the straight thread on the top of them. So all we need to do is screw these into each of the holes. Okay, we can go ahead and put this into the case. Okay, so we've got a few places we can mount our SSD in this case. We can mount it here, here, we can mount it here. So all I need you to do is put 4 of these little bits of rubber into the places I'm going to install the drive into. So before we go ahead and put the drive on, I'm just going to plug the cables in. So if you look closely at our SATA SSD, you'll see there's 2 gold connectors. They're both in an L shape. This one to the right hand side, the shorter one, is for the SATA data cable coming from the motherboard. The larger L-shaped cable to the left hand side is for the SATA power cable coming from our power supply. So it's just important we line the L's of each of them up. So there is the data cable getting plugged in. And then just going to bring the SATA power cable in through the bottom and push it into place. Now that's the cables installed, to install the drive on the case, all I need to do is line things up with the holes, and it should just be a matter of pushing it in. And there we go. Certainly one of the easiest SSD mounting that I've done in any case. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and install our case fans in the case. But before we come on to that, I want to talk a little bit about the fans. So our fans have a front and a back. We can tell this side is the front because the fan blades are unobstructed. This is the back because you tend to have the text and information on it, and you tend to have these little bits of plastic obstructing the fan blades. So air is going to move in from the front of the fan and out the back. So it's important we install our case fans in the case in the orientation that we want air to move. In general, in a PC case, you're going to have your fans at the front and at the bottom as intakes, and you're going to have your fans at the top and the rear as exhausts. And that generally encourages the path of air from the case to move in from the bottom and out the back and out the top, and that tends to work well for most PC cases. Importantly, the front of our case, it doesn't actually have any airflow. There's a solid panel over the front of it. So our case is going to get all its intake from the bottom and from the side, and it's going to exhaust air then out the top. So importantly, when we install our fans down the bottom, we're going to want them as intake. So we're going to install them with the back of the fan facing into the case. So it's going to pull cool air in from the bottom of the case and up and into the case. At the top, we're going to install fans in the same orientation. We're just going to move it up this way, but this time the front of the fan is facing the inside of the case. So it's going to be drawing hot air from inside the case and then exhausting it out the top of the case. The other important thing when you're installing fans in a case is the wire coming from the fans. In general, you want this at the back of the case so the wires are easy to cable management and they're going to be out of sight. Okay, so this is the bottom of our case, so we can go ahead and remove the dust filter from the bottom of it. Okay, so we've got our two Noctua slim fans, and in the box you get a selection of anti-vibration pads in a variety of colours. So I'm just going to select the black ones and add these on to the fans. Okay, so looking at our bracket, we want our fans to be intakes, so we need to install them with the front facing down the way. The other thing is we're going to have lots of intake over to the right hand side of the case and very little over to the left. So I'm going to try and get the fans all the way to the left hand side if I can. The other important point is we want the wires coming out the back of the case from the fans so they can't be seen. So we go ahead and turn things over and get the fans screwed in. So really important that we don't over tighten these fans, we only want them very slightly tight. If we over tighten them, you can actually twist the fan out of shape and cause some noise. Okay, so we can go ahead and put our bottom dust filter back on again and turn the things over. So probably the easiest way to put this bottom panel back on is with the case upside down. So I'm just going to lower the fan cables into the case, line this panel up with the back of the case, and then just lower things down and push it into place. We can then go ahead and secure the bottom of the case in place with the screw we removed earlier on. Next thing for us to do is to install our included case fans on the top panel. So we want our case fans to be exhaust at the top, so we're going to want to install them with the front of the fans facing into the case. The other important thing is we're going to want our cables facing the rear of the case, so in the orientation I have them round this way, that's how they're going to be. So I'm going to leave them this way round, and we'll put our second case fan on. Now, Cooler Master have quite a nice mounting system. They include these two metal brackets to secure the fans to the top of the case. So all we need to do is push the brackets through the fans. Go ahead and make sure it's through both sides of the fan. And then once it is, all we need to do is line it up with these little rubber grommets at the top of the case. Once things are lined up, all we need to do is push and the fan is secured at the top of the case. So the same process with the second fan, just going to push the little metal brackets through the holes on both sides of the fan. Okay, that's it all the way through. Next we'll line up the little metal pins with the rubber grommets underneath. Once we're happy everything's in place, we'll just apply a little bit of pressure, and that's our second case fan at the top installed. Let's go ahead and get this into the case. Before we can go ahead and put our top panel on the case, we just need to replace the little bracket we removed earlier on and secure it in place with the 4 screws. Next we can simply insert the cables from the fans into the case, line the top of the case up, and then just push it into place. At the rear of the case we have a place for a screw which can secure the top of the case in place. I'm going to be taking this on and off quite a bit as I'm changing the fans out to do the thermal testing, so I'm not going to secure mine in place, but if you want to, you can put one of the screws from the accessory box into here to secure the top of the case in place. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug our case fans into the motherboard. We've got 4 case fans, 2 at the bottom and 2 at the top, and this is going to give us a problem because our motherboard only has 1 system fan header. My previous air-cooled build also had 4 case fans, and thankfully Cooler Master includes a triple fan splitter cable. So I was able to plug 3 of those case fans into the triple fan splitter cable, the other end into the system fan header, and then I was able to use the pump fan header for my remaining 4th fan. The problem is our AIO is going to use the pump fan header, so we can't use that for our 4th fan, and we're going to be a fan short if we use this triple splitter cable. What I would recommend you getting is a fan hub. I've got one here from G.Skill. One end of it we're going to plug into the system fan header on our motherboard. We're going to power the hub using the SATA power supply cable that we plugged in earlier. And then if you look, there's 5 fan connectors on each side, allowing us to power up to 10 fans from the one hub. We're only going to need to use 4 of them, but it's going to solve our problem. So we'll go ahead and get this plugged in. First thing for us to do is to plug the cable coming from our fan hub into our system fan header, which is just here to the right of the M.2 heatsink. Next thing to do is to plug the SATA cable coming from our fan hub into our SATA power cable. So again, we're just going to line the L's up and making sure they're round the right way, and then just pushing them into place. So we have a look at the back of our fan hub. You'll notice the headers are labelled 1 through 10. In general, with most fan hubs, it's good practice to occupy them in order, starting with fan slot number 1. So we've got 4 fans, so we're going to occupy slots 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay, so we'll go ahead and plug our cables in. So we'll line things up and push. So there's fan 1, fan number 2, fan 3 and fan 4. Next thing for us to do is to install our AIO. So what we have here is the pump head. We've got a cold plate, we've got some tubes, and we've got a radiator. So we're going to apply some thermal paste and then put the cold plate on top of the CPU. Water is then going to circulate coming up to the pump head, cooling our CPU down. Hot water is then going to return to the radiator. We're going to have fans on the radiator, which are going to blow cool air through the radiator, cooling the water down. The cool water is then going to come back to the CPU and repeat that process. Okay, so looking at how we're going to connect all this up. So both of the fans have a standard 4-pin fan connector coming from them, and they both need to end up going into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Obviously we've got 2 connectors here, there's 1 CPU fan header, so they include a standard 2-to-1 fan splitter cable. So we're going to plug both of the fans into this adapter and then plug this end into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. So this really is one of the more simple AIOs to install. The only other cables that we have, there's 2 additional cables coming from the pump. The first is a 3-pin power connector, and that is going to go into the pump header on the motherboard, which is right beside the CPU fan header. And that's going to power our pump and allow our motherboard to control the speed of the pump. Important to mention, this is a 3-pin connector, so we're not going to be able to run the pump in PWM mode. We're going to have to run it in DC mode. But don't worry, I'll show you how to do that when we get into the BIOS later on in the video. The only other connector that we have coming from the pump head is a 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB connector. And we have 2 options with this connector. We can plug this straight into the addressable ARGB header on our motherboard, and our motherboard has one of those. We can then use the Dragon Center software to control the lighting on the pump head. So that's option 1. The second option is we can use the supplied controller to control the lighting. And that's the method I'm going to use, so I'll show you that as we set up the AIO. First thing for us to do is to secure these brackets to the pump head, and that's going to allow us to attach the pump to our motherboard. So all we need to do is set the brackets on the top, turn things over, and then we can go ahead and secure things in place. There's 1 screw needed on each side. Okay, so it's just the same process with the other side. Attaching the bracket over the top, turning things upside down, and then we just need to secure things in place with a screw on each side. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm going to use this controller to control the RGB on the pump head. So the first thing for us to do is to connect up this little ARGB connector coming from the pump head to the supplied cable. Now importantly, what you'll note is there's a little arrow here on one side of it. You'll notice we've got 3 pins on the bottom. There's 2 pins together, a space, and then 1 pin. Looking at the cable, it's the same pattern. There's 2 pins, a space, and then another pin. And if we look as well, there's an arrow to help line the 5-volt pins up. So all we want to do is line up the 2 5-volt pins. 2 arrows are lined up, and then we're just going to push the cables together. So that's clicked into place. Cooler Master supply a little cover which is going to hold these cables in place and prevent them from coming loose. So we're going to slip this over the top. Next thing for us to do is to connect the other end of this cable up to the controller. The controller is very simply, there's just a button here to press to cycle through the effects, and I'll show you this later on in the video once everything is connected up. So we've got the connection on the side here to plug this into, so I'm going to go ahead and plug this in now. So the only additional thing we'll need to plug in is plug this SATA cable into our SATA cable coming from our power supply. That is going to power the controller, allowing it to work. Next thing for us to do is to get our fans onto the radiator, but we need to have a think about which way we're going to put the fans on the radiator. We've already talked about the orientation of the fans when we discussed the case fans. There's a front and a back. We can have the fan either as an intake or an exhaust. Importantly, with an AIO, you will get much better CPU temperatures with the fans as an intake. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have this on the side as an intake. You then have 2 choices. You can have the fans first and then the radiator, or the radiator first and then the fans. What I have found is having the fans first towards the outside of the case and then the radiator next will give you slightly better temperatures. So that is the fan pushing through the radiator. It's an intake, but it's the fan in a push configuration through the radiator. The alternative is we can also have the fan as an intake, but install the fan behind the radiator in a pull configuration. So it is pulling cooler through the radiator and into the case. Both ways are intake, one is push, one is pull. The advantages, I think, of the push configuration from what I have tested, it's going to give you slightly better temperatures, but because the fan is closer to the outside of the case, it's going to give you slightly more noise. Pull configuration is very slightly less effective, maybe only 1 or 2 degrees on maximum CPU temperatures, but it will be a bit quieter. The other factor to factor in is sometimes if you have nice ARGB fans, you'll either want to see them on the outside of the case or the inside of the case, and that's going to determine what you do as well. I think the most important determiner in our case is these cables. We're going to have our radiator right up the front. These cables are going to have quite a bend to then go in over to where the CPU is on the motherboard. If we install the radiator first, it's going to give us more space between the front of the radiator and the back of the case. And that's going to mean there's less of a bend on those tubes. If we install the fans first and then the radiator is going to be further towards the back of the case, so there's going to be an even bigger bend on these cables. So I've already sized up both options in the case, and I think what we're going to do is have the radiator first, then the fans behind the radiator in a pull configuration, bringing cooler in from the front of the case. Then the final thing to factor in is where we want the cables coming out from the fans. Importantly, remember the fan cables are going to go to the top of the motherboard towards the CPU fan header. So it makes sense that the cables come out towards the top of the radiator. Okay, so our radiator is going to go up this way. This is going to be the front of the case. This is going to be the inside of the case. As we said, we want the fans pulling air through the radiator, so the front needs to go up against the radiator. And in this orientation, the fan is going to be going up towards the top of the case. So this is the orientation that we want to have our fans on. Included with the AIO, you've got these longer screws. So we're going to slide these through the fans and first of all just hand tighten them. Next we can very gently tighten each of the screws. We don't want to over tighten them because that's just going to add to the noise if we distort the fans by over tightening them, bending them out of shape. So it's just a very gentle tighten. Okay, final thing for us to do before we go ahead and install this into the case is to plug in the twin fan splitter cable into each of these fans. So it just matter of lining things up. They only can go in one way. We now can go on ahead and put on the side bracket from the case. And then again in the AIO box we're going to have shorter screws this time to secure the radiator to the case. Again, it's important we don't over tighten this again so we don't damage the radiator. First thing for us to do is to apply some thermal paste to the CPU. There's a whole variety of different ways of doing this. My preferred method is just to apply a pea-sized amount to the middle of the CPU. So that looks about right. Before we go ahead and install our pump head onto the CPU, we need to remove the layer of plastic protection. Next we just need to lower the pump head down and slide the little metal brackets over the black plastic clips on the motherboard. Okay, that's the front one on. And then we'll just get the bottom one at the bottom as well. So that's the bottom one on. Then it's just a matter of tightening things up. I tend to do a few turns of one, then a few turns of the other, and that way you don't over tighten any one side. We can now go ahead and remove the plastic protection from the pump head. The two headers that we're going to need to plug into are just to the right of the RAM at the top of the motherboard. The one closest to the RAM is the CPU fan header, and the one furthest away from the RAM is the pump header. So we're going to need to plug the double fan splitter cable coming from the two fans on our radiator into the CPU fan header. So we'll go ahead and plug that in first of all. So we just line things up with the header and then we go ahead and push things into place. The next cable to plug in is this 3-pin cable coming from the pump header. So we're going to go ahead and plug this into the pump fan header, and that's going to power our pump. Even though it's got 3 pins and the cable has 4 pins, there's only 3 of the pins it will fit onto because there's little notches on the cable and little notches on the header. So we'll go ahead and line things up. Okay, so that's those 2 cables plugged in. Okay, the next thing for us to do, I think, is some cable management, tidying up all these cables. Then we can go ahead and get our graphics card in, and then the last step is going to be putting the side bracket on with the AIO on it. So looking at the cables at the bottom fans we're going to bring down the back and over to here. We've got some Velcro straps where we can then bring all the cables up at the bottom of the power supply bracket. Our little fan hub is magnetic, so I think I'm going to bring that out towards the front of the case where we can just take the front panel off to access the fan hub. So let's go ahead and get the cables tidied up. We're also going to need to power our fan hub, so I'm going to go ahead and plug that into one of the spare SATA connectors. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring the little RGB controller out to the front of the case and stick it here using the magnets. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and install our graphics card. To do that, we're going to have to remove the first and second bracket from the top. So just need to loosen the screws on the side. All brackets simply fall out. To prepare the motherboard to receive the graphics card, we just need to open this little clip here. Next, we need to line the graphics card up with the slot on the motherboard. Once we're happy everything's lined up, we just need to apply a little bit of pressure and it should lock and click into place. And you hear there the little clip is closed. And then it's just a matter of securing things into place with the 2 screws we removed earlier on. Our graphics card has an 8-pin and a 6-pin power connector, so we can go ahead and plug these in now. And the additional 2-pin, we can just go ahead and tuck in with the rest of the cable out of the way. Last thing for us to do is to go ahead and get the AIO into the case. Before I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and plug the cables in again to the double fan splitter cable coming from the CPU fan header. Okay, so we just need to line the bracket up. And then we can secure things into place with the 2 screws we removed at the start. Next we can go ahead and put the panels back on. The build is complete. We've now reached the moment of truth where we need to go ahead and flip the power switch and see if we get a boot screen. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I've done a video on it. I'll put a link to that video in the description. Okay, here goes. Okay, so we can hear the fans are spinning up. I can see lights on the graphics card and lights on the RAM, so that's a good sign. Next, we're just watching the screen and we've got the MSI logo appearing briefly, which again is just what we're looking for. Next thing we're looking for is the Windows logo to appear. If that happens, it will have found the bootable USB drive in the back of the computer and have booted off that. Obviously, we don't have any operating system in any of the SSDs in the PC, so it's not going to be able to boot off that. And there we go, we've got the Windows logo appearing. And breached the Windows installer screen. So I'm now going to show you how to install Windows 10, but I'm going to flip over to screen mode to make things a bit easier. Okay, so we're in the United Kingdom, so I'm just going to leave all these and click Next. And then I'm going to click on Install Now. If you've got a Windows 10 product key, you can go ahead and put it in this box. I'll show you what happens if you don't have a product key, so I'm going to click I don't have a product key. What you need to do is select which version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. So I'm going to click on Windows 10 Pro and click Next. Another question I'm often asked is, will Windows work without a product key? And the answer is yes, you can go ahead and install it. There will be a watermark on it and you'll have some limited functionality, but yes, Windows will work without the product key. So I'm going to accept the license terms, click Next, and we're going to do a custom install. Okay, so looking at our drives, we have got 3 drives on this PC. We've got our KC600B, which is our SATA SSD, and we've got drives 1 and 2, which are our M.2 SSDs. So I want to install Windows on the M.2 SSD, so I'm going to go ahead and select drive 1 and click Next. And this next stage will just take a little bit of time, so I'll speed it up for you. Okay, so as we go along, I'm going to pick a series of options. Obviously, if you have different options, go on ahead and pick the options that you want. So I'm in the United Kingdom, I'm going to click Yes. Keyboard layout in the United Kingdom as well. I don't want a secondary keyboard, so I'm going to click Skip. I'm going to set it up for personal use, I'm going to click on that and Next. Now we've got a couple of options here. If you have a Microsoft account, you go ahead and enter your details. If you don't, you can create an online account, or you also have an option of an offline account, so you don't need to be connected to the internet to set up Windows. I'm going to show you the offline account for this one. Again, it's going to give you some prompts that maybe you want to go ahead and set up the online account. I'm going to go for limited experience with an offline account, and then it's going to ask me to type my name. Click Next and make a password. Confirm the password. And then I'm going to have to fill in some security questions. Okay, we've got a series of options here, so I'm going to choose not to use online speech recognition and click accept. So let Microsoft Apps use your location. I'm going to click on yes, accept. Find my device, yes, accept. Send diagnostic data to Microsoft. We're just going to send the required diagnostic data. Improve inking and typing. I'm going to click no to that. No again. No again. And I'm going to go for not now. Okay, so that's Windows installed. The first thing I like to do is get Windows fully up to date before I'll go ahead and install any drivers or programs. So to do that, we're going to click on the Windows icon on the bottom left hand corner, click on the settings, click on updates and security, and then we're going to go check for updates. What we're going to do is we're going to do any updates that are there. There's probably quite a few to install. We'll let them install. The computer may well need to restart. We're going to go back into the settings and check for any more updates, and we're not going to move forward until there's no more updates available. Okay, so that's Windows fully up to date. Next thing for us to do is to get all our SSDs showing up. So we head over to this PC. What you will notice is we've got our local disk C. This is the M.2 SSD, the 1TB drive that we've installed our operating system in. Normally if you've installed other new drives, they won't show up here. I have previously used this KC600 drive in another build and haven't formatted it again, so that's why it's currently showing up rather than being unavailable. So to get our other M.2 SSD drive to show up, what we'll need to do is go down the bottom here into the search and type in disk management. And this will come up with a shortcut to the control panel, create and format hard drive partitions. So we'll go ahead and click on that. It's going to give us a pop-up about disk 2, and it's going to tell us that we need to initialize the disk before we can use it. So we'll go ahead and click OK. Okay, so now if we see what we've got our SATA SSD, disk 1, which is one of our M.2 SSDs, and if we scroll down here, we've got our second drive, which is currently showing as unallocated space. So if I right click on it and click new symbol volume, next, next, it's assigned the drive the letter E, so I'm going to leave it as that and click next. If I want to change it, I can do that from the pull down menu, and then we just need to give it a name. And then I'm going to click on next and finish. Okay, so what we can now see is back over in my computer, the drive is now available and ready to use. Next thing for us to do is install some drivers. I'm going to get these from a variety of sources. Don't worry about trying to remember all the web pages as you go along. I'm going to put links to them all in the description. Okay, so starting off with our motherboard page over on MSI's website. So we're on the drivers tab and we just need to select our operating system, Windows 10 64-bit, and I'll go ahead and expand all these to show you what we have on offer. Okay, so looking at the drivers, we've got the AM4 RAID driver. I'm not going to use this, so there's no point downloading it. If you want to use RAID, you can obviously download the driver. The AMD chipset driver, we do want this, but I'm going to get this directly from AMD's website. It tends to be a little bit more up to date there. The onboard VGA drivers, we've got a dedicated graphic card rather than using integrated graphics, and we're going to get our drivers from NVIDIA. So as we're not going to use this, there's no point downloading it. So we'll go ahead and download the Bluetooth driver. Now most of these three drivers, Windows will have found alternative versions to all the drivers we're going to install here. I'm going to show you how to install them for completeness, but the steps are quite often optional. If your computer's working well, you can quite often just leave it. Click on the wireless setup. We're going to go to extract all, click extract. and then click on the wireless setup. Click yes, next, next, I accept, next. We're just going for typical install and click install. And finish. Okay, we'll get the Intel Wi-Fi drivers next. Download. I will click on the installer, click on the wireless setup, click extract all, extract. And click on the wireless setup. We're going to click next, agree, install, yes. And finish. And last one here is Ethernet drivers. Okay, we'll click on the setup file. Yes. Click next, install. And then finish. Okay, and then the last driver we have here is the onboard audio driver, so we'll go ahead and download that. Click on the setup file. Yes. Next. And we're going to go ahead and restart our computer, so we'll click finish. Okay, so that's all the drivers that we're going to install from MSI's page. Just before we leave here, I'll show you a couple of other things. If we go over and click on utilities, you can see here we've got the MSI Dragon Center. Now, if your motherboard has RGB on it, or if you've actually plugged any RGB fans into either the addressable or the standard RGB header on the motherboard, you're going to want to install this to allow you to control the lighting on the motherboard and anything actually connected to the motherboard's RGB headers. Our motherboard doesn't actually have any RGB on it. The only thing that has RGB is the RAM. We're going to use the RAM manufacturer's software to control the lighting on it, so we're not going to need to install this. The other thing we might want to install is the BIOS. So we have a look and see the latest version is from the 16th of November. And I am planning on getting a new CPU in the future, so it probably is worth me updating the BIOS. I don't routinely recommend updating the BIOS unless there's new features that you need or you're having problems with your computer, because if you do it wrong, you can actually brick your motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and download this now. Okay, and if I head over to the downloads, I'm going to copy the file and put it onto an external hard drive which I've plugged in to the computer. And this is going to allow me to install the BIOS later when we head over to it. Okay, so we're finished with MSI's page, but we haven't finished installing all the drivers that we're going to need to. Next thing is to head over to AMD's page to get the chipset driver. Okay, so we're over on AMD's page. We're going to click on chipsets. We've got an AM4 socket and we've got a B550 motherboard. So we're going to click submit. We're going to expand here and we can see that the latest driver there. So we're going to click download. Go ahead and open this. Click yes. And we're going to go ahead and click install. Okay, so that's installed successfully. We'll click on restart. Okay, last driver for us to get is for our graphics card. We have an NVIDIA graphics card, so we're going to need to get our drivers from NVIDIA's site. We can either get the drivers separately like we've done before, or we can actually go ahead and install the GeForce Experience. I prefer to do this, so I'm going to go and show you how to do this. Click download now. Go ahead and open it. Click yes. We'll agree and install. Okay, if you don't have an account, you need to create one, so I'm going to put my login details in. Okay, I'm going to skip the tour, and then what we need to do is click on drivers, and then if we click on these three dots up at the top right hand corner, you can choose which version of the driver you want. So you can either install a game ready driver or a studio driver. A question I often get asked, can we not install both? The answer is no, you have to pick between them. So if you play more games, go for the game ready driver. If you use your PC more for content creation, pick the studio driver. They will work for, like the studio driver will work for gaming and the game driver will work for content creation, but they're optimized for one or the other. So one you're going to have a slightly better experience in. I prefer to use my PC for content creation, so I'm going to click the studio drivers. So it's found the latest version. I'm going to click download. Okay, I'm just going to go for an express installation, so I'll click on that. Click yes. And then we need to expect the screen to flicker as the drivers have been installed. Don't worry, that's normal. Okay, that's it installed. We'll click on close. Okay, so we need to download the lighting control for our RAM, so I'll click on download and open file. Double click on the application, yes, next, next, install. It's going to ask us to restart our computer. We'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we've got a range of effects over here: static breathing, strobing, cycle, rainbow, breathing rainbow, comet, and comet rainbow. We've got the individual LEDs and the colors they're currently set to, and we can change these using here or here. Because we can't actually see our RAM very well, I'm going to go ahead and turn the RAM off so it's not distracting. So I click on LED off and click apply. Okay, so that's everything installed that I want to install in Windows. Next thing for us to do is to go over to the BIOS. We're going to update the BIOS. We're going to need to look at our RAM speed, because the chances are our RAM is not running at the full 3600 megahertz. And then we want to have a look at the fan curves to check all our coolers and fans are running just the way we want them to. So to enter the BIOS, what we need to do is click on restart. And then whenever the MSI logo appears at the start, we need to press the delete key. It can be hard to time it right, so normally once the screen goes to black, I start pressing the delete key, and then that way we're not going to miss it. So it's gone black. I'm going to start pressing the delete key now. And there's the logos appeared, and we should now load into the BIOS. Okay, so looking at the version of the BIOS that is installed, the one that is from the 31st of August 2020, we've got a much later one, so I'm going to go ahead and update it. Like I've mentioned, don't do this unless you have to, because you can brick your motherboard if things go wrong. It's really important that you don't lose power during the install, or there's a good chance you will brick your motherboard. So to update the BIOS, we need to use the M-Flash utility, so we'll go ahead and click on it. And we're going to go yes. Okay, so what we need to do is select the version of the BIOS that we want to install. So we've got our file here. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And it's asking us, are we sure we want to select this file? I'm going to click yes. And then we'll go ahead and let the BIOS install. Like I've mentioned, really important your computer does not lose power during this process. Okay, so the PC has rebooted into Windows after the BIOS update. So I'm going to restart things again and re-enter the BIOS. Okay, so that's us into the BIOS, and what we can see is the version has been updated to the latest one from the 14th of November. Next thing for us to do is to have a look at our memory speed. So we click on the memory. What you will notice, our memory is currently running at 2133 megahertz. Our memory is rated for 3600 megahertz, so we look over here, there's two XMP profiles, profile 1 and profile 2, which are exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and enable profile 1 by clicking up here. And that should increase our memory speed up to 3600 megahertz. Next thing for us to do is to have a look at our fans and make sure they're set up the way I want them to. So I'm going to click on settings. So looking at the first fan, this is our CPU fan header, and into this we've got the two fans on the radiator plugged in via that double fan splitter cabled to the CPU fan header. So at the moment we can see the temperature source is the CPU core, which is just the way we want it to be. It's running in auto mode. Both the fans are 4-pin connectors on them, so they can run in PWM mode. So I'm going to enable PWM mode. They also have the smart fan mode enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that on. Okay, next going on to look at our pump header, and this is obviously where our AIO is plugged into. What we can see at the moment is running in PWM mode, taking its temperature source off the CPU core, and smart fan mode is disabled. Now importantly, this connector only has 3 pins, so it cannot run in PWM mode. If you plug a 3-pin connector into a header that's enabled for PWM mode, the device connector will run at 100% of the speed. So we need to change over to DC mode. We've got the option of running the smart fan mode. I tend not to run this on the pump, so I'm going to leave that disabled. Next thing, we'll head over to our system fan header. Remember, this motherboard only has one system fan header, and we've plugged in our PWM fan hub to this. We can already see these fans are running at quite a fast speed. They look to be running at 100%, and actually the PC is pretty noisy. I don't know if you can hear it in the background or not. At the moment that is in DC mode. We have obviously a 4-pin connector, and it should be running in PWM mode. It is taking its temperature off the CPU core, so I'm going to change this over to PWM mode. And you'll notice already the speed of the fans is going down, and the noise in the background is also going down. I normally do run smart fan mode on my system fans, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. And then looking at our chipset fan, we can see it's running in balance mode. They only have PWM as the only option, and it's taking its temperature source off the chipset, so there's no need to make any changes to here. So to save things, we can go ahead and just press the X button. To save our changes, we just need to press the X button again and click yes. First thing to do is to check our RAM is running at the correct speed. To do this, right click on the Windows icon and go to Task Manager. We're then going to click on More Details, click on the Performance tab, and then click on the memory. So what we can see, our memory speed is now 3600 megahertz. Okay, so that's just finished. The PC is up and running and everything's working really well. Remember, I have made a previous build guide in this case looking at air cooling, and I'm going to make one more water-cooled build using an AIO. This time I'm going to install the AIO down the bottom and install the graphics card in a vertical position and use the tempered glass panel. So I'm going to put links to both those build guides in the description so you can check those out before deciding which of them you want to follow. Another important video you're probably going to want to check out is the thermal testing. I'm going to do my case review and include the thermal testing from all 3 builds in this case in that video. So again, that's probably worth checking out before again you decide which of the build guides you want to follow. So hopefully you find this video useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. The channel's growing really well, but you can help it grow even better by hitting that button and help other viewers find the content on the channel. Likewise, if you're new to the channel, I've got loads of other build guides and PC related content, so please go ahead and check those out. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Center of attention, they all want some. I'm like fire, hot as the sun. The dance floor is burning, call 911. Hands on my body, I'm loving the heat, but it won't come easy, nothing's for free. If you want me, then prove it, baby.